also would like to make a special mention of an honored guest, Professor Sohail Bushrui here. For those of you who are lucky to have taken a couple of courses with him, you know what his classes are like. It's an honor to have you here, sir.
My honor to
It is really a true pleasure to introduce Mr. Majd to you. It's rare that you have a father and son for a friend. Two for the price of one. In the early 1980s in Tehran, I had the pleasure of knowing Mr. Nasir Majd, a retired diplomat who at that time was not that old, but he had decided he didn't want to be part of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And years later, I visited him frequently in London, his apartment, and I've always replenished my store of stories, jokes, and various other wonderful goodies from his presence. Some years ago, I came to know this book, The Ayatollah Begs to Differ, Mr. Human Majd's first book, and having a hunch that he might be related to my friend Mr. Nasir Majd, I called him in London, and he didn't deny it. So, and when I visited him a year later in London, I saw that he had this book in his apartment, and this is true. And he was walking with such pride with this, his son's book, his son's first book. Not that he's new to journalism. He has worked for many, many decades, Mr. Majd has. But this was his first book of substantive dimensions and a very solid thesis. That was 2006 or 7, right?
Yeah,
2007. And now in 2011, we have the new book that we're using in our class, The Ayatollah's Democracy. Even the cover suggests that this is a jollier book than this one, doesn't it? I mean, I like the beards, the way they've been dyed. So, and the style shows that as well. It's obvious to me, or so I think at least, disabuse me if I'm wrong, that in the first book he was holding a serious face and trying to talk about a very funny place. And now in this book, he comes to realize that this is really a funny place, and he lets himself loose. I love the refrain of "Nemishe ma kardim o shod," which in Persian means impossible. No, we did it and it was possible. So, and a lot of other things. Nemishe is a wonderful word in Persian that so many ideas are always on the negative side are communicated with it. Anyway, we have had fun reading this book over the past 5 or 6 weeks in my class, Persian 353, Iranian Life and Literature and Film. And now we're going to say goodbye to this with a wonderful crescendo of having the author here. I know some of you have had questions. Some of you have even had serious questions about the book. So without further ado, let me request that Mr. Majd take the podium and enlighten us for about 20 minutes before opening the floor to your questions, objections, expressions of gratitude, etc., etc. Please.
And expressions of hatred as well, because I imagine there must be some of that. When you're talking about my father and his pride for pride for me and about the books, he also got some calls from people who were very anti-Islamic Republic on both my books and on some of my articles in various places. And his refrain is, "I can't control my 55-year-old son." It's like, I agree with you, but I can't control him. He's his own man. I am my own man, that's true. Just going to briefly introduce myself in terms of who I am and who I'm not. I'm speaking at a university, and there are people here who are far more expert on Iran than I am. A bunch of academics and students who probably know a lot more than I do about Iran. I've never claimed to know an awful lot about Iran. I never lived there as a child. I even went to nursery school in America and then did some schooling in England. Never really lived in Iran, and except for 1 year when I was in, I can't remember, second grade, I think. And I went to the American school in Tehran with American diplomats mostly. And that was a long time ago, before there were many Iranians who went to English-speaking schools. So I didn't really have an experience of living in Iran until, oddly enough, last year. I moved to Iran in 2011, spent most of the year there, researching my next book, which will not come out till 2013. So I can talk about some of those experiences which may be interesting, but I want to talk specifically a little bit about the Ayatollah's Democracy, because it's a book that you have either read or studied, and Dr. Greg Mackcox just mentioned it. The title was always supposed to be somewhat ironic, and I wrote the book I was going to write the book before the Green Movement of 2009, before the elections of 2009. My editor and I decided to keep the title after the elections because it became more ironic than it was. But it still was very much an attempt to both put the Green Movement in perspective, in the perspective of how Iranians viewed it inside Iran, not the diaspora, and also to kind of try to explain somewhat to an American audience and to a European audience and elsewhere what it is that drives Iran, both its leadership and its people, in terms of their political vision, in terms of what they want to see their country become. And I purposefully do not, or have not, ever really considered the voices of the Iranian diaspora, and of course here we have them very well represented, because I feel that I've got to write from the perspective of somebody who observes Iran, not from the perspective of an Iranian American who lives here, and our ideas of Iran are colored by what we see and what we hear all the time. It's impossible to understand Iran, in my opinion, by reading news here, or following Iran, or even talking on the phone to people in Iran. It's impossible to know what's really going on and how people really think without actually being there, which is why I've always gone there, and I've gotten into trouble for it in the past, and so on and so forth. I haven't been in jail yet, but that's probably coming sometime soon. Definitely after my next book, if I go to Iran. But I feel that it's important to get a perspective not just of the opposition to the Iranian regime, which is large, the opposition to a specific government, which is also large, but also the ordinary people who either don't care about politics, and they have every right to not care about politics. We want people to always be like, stand up for your rights, go and do this, go and do that, go and protest, go and, make a change, bring Iran into the 21st century. If somebody doesn't want to, we should let them not want to. It's the same here. People in Iran are not that different from people anywhere else in the world, and I think it's curious that we're talking about it today because of the Oscar win on Sunday night with the movie A Separation. I don't know if anybody saw this, but like the Israeli press was talking about the movie and interviewing people in Israel who'd gone and seen the movie, gone and seen the film in Israel. It's a big hit there apparently. And people were saying like, gee, I didn't know that Iranians had washing machines and dishwashers in their homes. And that's the impression we have of Iran. And I'm not talking about the Iranian diaspora, particularly those who go back and forth or have family in Iran. But by and large, the American media does not focus on who the Iranian people are, what they're like, what Iran is like, what the political system is like, and how people manage. What we're focused on today is obviously the nuclear issue, more than anything else, which for most Iranians is not the biggest issue. It's a big issue because it's what has caused this huge rift with the West, and obviously has caused these sanctions now, which are making life intolerable for many people who are directly affected by the sanctions. But the nuclear issue itself is not an issue for most Iranians. Most Iranians view Iranian progress as a progress of a nation, not progress by the mullahs or the ayatollahs. It's not really a political issue for them. It's just an issue of, well, this is Iranian progress. We're going to have nuclear power one day. We have the right to have nuclear power like every other country, and we're not going to be dictated to. And then that's it. The biggest issue for most Iranians is, how do I make a living? How do I survive under relatively dire economic situation that is either caused by mismanagement by the government or sanctions from the West, or a combination of the two, in most people believe it's a combination of the two. Most people think that sanctions are making life very difficult for business, for Iranians, and the government's mismanagement is also making the economic situation in Iran very bad. Now that paints a picture, again, if you're looking at it from here and you read the press all the time, you're going, well, God, Iran is like really in a terrible state and people are suffering and all that. But that's not true either. If you were to go to Tehran tomorrow and land at the airport and drive around the city, you'd see people living their lives. You'd see people doing exactly what they were doing in the movie Separation. You see people going to parties, you see people getting married, people having fun, people going to cafes, people going to restaurants, people living under a system which they may not like, but they're living, and they have to live their lives under that system. And then you talk about political repression, and you think about the things that we read about here, about how the Green Movement's been suffocated, how their leadership is in jail, how anybody who speaks out against the system gets thrown in jail. Well, that's true. Largely it's true. But again, that does not affect daily life the way that we know it, in the same way it doesn't affect daily life for many other people. And Iran, despite not being a democracy, and I'll get to the title of my book, despite certainly not being a democracy by any standard, and certainly not by Western standards, is not the kind of dictatorship that we imagine when we think of dictatorships. It's not North Korea. It's not Cuba. It's not Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It's not even Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. It's not an absolute dictatorship. And I don't think it can be an absolute dictatorship under the system that it is today, that exists today. It is dictatorial. It is an autocratic system. There is one person who has final say over everything, which is the supreme leader, and not President Ahmadinejad, as many people in the media continue to believe here. But the supreme leader is not in a position, even if he wanted to act as a dictator, as an absolute dictator. It would not, first of all, not be in his interest, and secondly, I don't think he would survive very long if he tried to act as an absolute dictator. There are far too many opposing viewpoints, even within the conservatives, as we're witnessing in this parliamentary election that's happening this Friday. It's a system that's very complicated, and certainly in 10 minutes I couldn't get into, but I get into quite a bit in the second book in terms of what the actual political system is. It seems very opaque. It seems like impossible to understand. Most Iranians don't even understand it. Iranians who live there don't even understand how this system can survive when it's so convoluted a system. Certainly, by no stretch of the imagination, democratic. But there is one aspect of the Iranian people, and I would say even an aspect of the leadership, and I include in the leadership people who've worked in government, who may not be in government today, people who've been in parliament, who may not be in parliament today, people who have worked for the Iranian nation and for the Islamic Republic, really, which is what it is. And that aspect is a form of democracy. A form of democracy that may not be the liberal democracy that we know in the West, but will be a uniquely Iranian form of democracy. It depends on how we define democracy. Do we define it in the traditional Greek sense? Do we define it in the American liberal sense? Do we define it in the socialist, more socialist European sense? The Iranians want to define it themselves. They want to define democracy the way they see it. And what most Iranians recognize inside Iran, even those who hate the regime and go out and protest or get thrown in jail, the one thing they do recognize that Iran is not the same as other countries and has a unique character. And in that character there is a lot of religion. And in that religion, there's a lot of, in that group of people who are very religious, there's a lot of support for an Islamic system, a system that is still Islamic, even though it's much more democratic than it is today. What you have in Iran today is so many different groups of people who have so many different ideas of what Iran should be. And all these ideas are clashing all the time, and you hear the conversations in Iran all the time. When I say it's not an absolute dictatorship the way that we imagine in the West, is the mere fact that these conversations happen. I don't mean behind closed doors necessarily, sometimes quite openly, sometimes even in the newspapers. I mean, people get arrested, sometimes newspapers get shut down, but the conversation goes on. And the opposition to what the status quo is in Iran continues. But one of the reasons for the failure of the Green Movement, and my book came out before it was evident that the Green Movement was a complete failure from the perspective of those observing Iran, or even from the people who live in Iran who are part of that Green Movement. The failure of the Green Movement is partly due to all these opposing ideas that exist within what is an opposition to the status quo. You have people in Iran who have given up, who just have given up hope. They look at a room like this filled with Iranians, successful, well-off Iranians, relatively well-off Iranians, studying in the West, going on to have careers in the West, and saying, you know, that's what I want to do. I'm talking about young people. And of course, Iran is a very young population. I want to leave, I want to go there, I want to go to university there, I want to get a job, and I want to live in an environment that is much less repressive. There are those people. And they are no longer interested in protest. They have really given up. And I've seen a lot of those people. I've seen a lot of the young people in Iran who feel that way. What's interesting is they don't really do very much about moving. They don't really do very much about like leaving, because they have family ties. There's all sorts of things that keep them in Iran. There are those people who are really disgusted with the regime and want it to be gone, but don't know how to go about bringing down the regime or bringing about the kind of change that could result in the regime changing. So they have silent protests. They boycott votes. They wear green wristbands to this day, and it's not illegal to wear a green wristband. You know, my local coffee shop in Tehran, all the employees wore green wristbands. Some of them wore green laces on their shoes. That's their form of silent protest, that this is not a system that we like. But they don't know how to go about doing anything else, and there's no one there to teach them. They have no leaders. An immediate question that can come up is, well, what about Mousavi and Karoubi and Khatami, the leaders of the Green Movement? Well, they've been silenced, as we know, and for a lot of reasons. Mousavi and Karoubi are no longer considered really the leaders of any opposition to the system, for a lot of reasons. One is that there are people, all these different groups that I'm talking about, who are opposed to the status quo. There's some people who don't think they went far enough. There's some people who don't think they had the gumption to take on the system. There's people who believe that they're still part of the system and they're still part of that Islamic Republic that needs to go. And there are people who are saying that they're too old, simply too old. They can't represent what the youth want and what the people of Iran want for the future. But what all these groups recognize is there's still quite a substantial amount of support for the system. Not necessarily for a man, not necessarily for Ayatollah Khamenei, not necessarily for President Ahmadinejad, but there is still a lot of support for a form of stability within this system, for there not to be a revolution, for there not to be a wholesale change. There are still a lot of very religious people in every neighborhood in Tehran, in every city, of course in the rural areas. You see very religious people who may not be in favor of what the policies of the Islamic Republic are. They may not be in favor of the Ayatollah Khamenei, or indeed any of the Ayatollahs, but they are religious, and they do believe in Islam. And they do believe there are limits that Islam sets on public behavior. That doesn't mean they believe that women have to wear headscarves, or they don't believe that women, the law should say they do. But they are religious people, and they want their families to behave that way, and they want a certain decorum, Islamic decorum, to be present in an Islamic republic. So people realize that they're up against a lot of people who have that kind of ideology, people who are in Iran. And so it's very difficult for them to say, well, we just want a secular republic. We just want something that's completely different, and this is how we're going to get there. People compare the Arab Spring to the 2009 Green Movement, and I would disagree with that, mainly because, I mean, oddly enough, I think the Iranian regime has actually been pretty much correct in saying that it wasn't the 2009 movement that inspired the Arab Spring. It was really more the Islamic Revolution. Not the Islamic aspect of it, but certainly in terms of what the people in the region wanted, which was a regime to go. I mean, they very clearly said in the Arab Spring, in every country, they want this dictator to go, this system to go. And that's exactly what happened in 1979 in Iran, without really thinking through what comes next. Nobody really thought at the time of Tahrir Square that the Muslim Brotherhood might be in charge of Egypt in the future. Nobody thought that would happen potentially in Tunisia as well. And that's the kind of thing that happened in 1979. So ironically, the Iranian mantra is probably more true than the Arab Spring being influenced by the 2009 movement, which in fact failed to change the behavior of the Iranian regime in any way or bring about any sort of significant change to Iran. In fact, if it did anything, it just made the government far, far more repressive and far more paranoid. I want to briefly, because I don't want to go too long before we start taking questions, briefly talk about what we do in America that affects Iran and how it affects Iran. Leaving aside the misconceptions that Americans may have about Iran, leaving aside the fact that we don't know they have dishwashers and drive Peugeots and wear Ray-Bans, leaving aside all that, we are under the impression, it seems to me, that in Iran there's this horrible dictatorship, that people want to rise up, they want to get rid of this dictatorship, they want to bring a more pro-Western government to power, and either we're not giving them the tools, or they don't have the tools, or the government's so brutal that it's going to be able to prevent this from happening. But maybe if we have all these harsh sanctions on Iran, maybe if we threaten them with war, maybe if we do this or that, the people of Iran will rise up and get rid of these horrible people who are running the country, and they will realize that they really should be listening to America because we know best. That couldn't be further from the truth. The sanctions are affecting Iranian lives. People are going to blame the Iranian government somewhat for the effects of the sanctions, but they're not going to just blame the Iranian government. They're blaming America for imposing these sanctions. When you talk to Iranians in Iran, they don't really understand why the sanctions are being imposed on them, why their particular lives are being affected, why this person lost their job yesterday because the factory shut down that could no longer import parts or do this or do that or have this kind of trade, and has to go figure out how to get a job. He doesn't understand why, he or she doesn't understand why, because if the sanctions are meant to get the Iranian people to rise up and change the government, very few Iranians believe that's going to happen inside Iran. If the sanctions are meant to get Iran to stop enriching uranium, very few Iranians believe that's going to happen either. So therefore, you've got the situation where there's this incredible pressure from the West on Iran, which brings up some nationalistic feelings among the Iranians anyway, those who live there, and even some of those who live here, and making life very difficult for any civil society to function in Iran. We are giving the Iranian government every excuse to suppress and oppress its people and their aspirations. We are taking away the ability of civil society to function in Iran. We're taking away the ability of a middle class to function. And the middle class is the vanguard of change in Iran. It always has been. And, you know, depending on what your definition of middle class is, the middle class 100 years ago in Iran was different than the middle class today. Middle class today in Iran is very European, very European-centric in their views. Even those who are quite religious, and they're very pro-business, but they're also pro-change, pro-reform. They're the middle class are the people who came out and protested in 2009. Largely, it was the middle class. It's the middle class today that is in jail, or the people who are still protesting, or agitating for change in Iran, or saying anything, you know, writing an article that the government doesn't like. But we are completely destroying that middle class by imposing the sanctions, not letting them have the ability to do business, to have a voice, and giving an excuse to the government to say, we are under pressure, we are under threats, we have to unify, we have to come together, we have to fight off these foreign invaders slash antagonistic nations who are out to get Iran because they just don't like Iran, they've never liked Iran. And we constantly give that excuse to the this particular Iranian regime. You have people like former President Khatami who says, and he believes it, by the way, he said to me, and he said it publicly, that if Iran is attacked militarily, we're all coming together. There is no green movement, reform movement, we're all the same. We will fight off any invader, we will come together. This is a man who has resisted this system for a while, at least since 2009. And you hear that all the time in Iran. That's in case of a military attack. But even in case of sanctions, anything that anybody says in Iran, when you have the talk of war and the talk of sanctions and the talk of crippling the Iranian economy, anybody who stands up and objects to the government or objects to the regime in any way is immediately accused of being a lackey of the West. At best, being a lackey of the West. At worst, being a spy. And there's people who are in jail for that. You know, if you work for the BBC, you get thrown in jail because you're a spy. You know, you're trying to foment revolution here and bring about a pro-Western government. And that's a really important key aspect of how the Iranian leadership looks at the current situation and how they look at what the West is trying to do. The West is trying to impose on Iran, as it has time and time again in the last 200 years, impose its view on Iran, dictate to Iran how it should behave, dictate to Iran what it can and cannot do. And that resonates with the Iranian people. It resonates, and we have to remember also that the Iranian government is very good at propaganda. We can think, yeah, well, state television in Iran is like so obvious. The Iranian people are far too sophisticated to buy that stuff or buy that crap that these guys say about this and that. And that's true to a large extent. But you have to remember the Iranian people still, they live there, they don't travel as often. It's difficult to travel, both for economic reasons and for reasons of visas and stuff like that. So Iranians are growing up in this system. They're growing up from being a baby to adulthood within this Islamic system with all this propaganda from the state, telling them that their rights are being denied them, telling them that their rights are going to be taken away, telling them that you can't be independent, you have to be allied to the West if you want to have the benefits that they have. And we, as a government, are resisting that. We as a people are resisting that. We've always been under attack, whether it's from the Arabs or whether it's from the West, and we have to unify and resist that. And that propaganda works. Propaganda generally does work, and it works over time, and it works gradually. And sometimes it's very crude propaganda, which the Iranians can see right through, and sometimes it's very effective propaganda. And it does affect you when you're living there. If you're living in Iran, it's very hard to have a good image of what the West is trying to do to Iran, or with Iran, or how they're trying to negotiate the nuclear issue, which makes it almost impossible for civil society to do anything, apart from the fact that the regime has been, very brutal and very harsh on any kind of opposition to the regime or to even the government. In the last year, things have changed a little bit. A lot of the red lines that existed prior to 2011 have been crossed in terms of being able to criticize the government, not the regime, but the government. So in the last year, Iran was actually pretty vibrant politically in terms of criticizing Ahmadinejad, for example, that was unheard of the year before, or certainly after 2009. But that doesn't mean that the people who really want serious change in Iran are allowed to criticize or allowed to organize in any way. And that situation is only getting worse. I don't know, I can't predict, as I said, I'm not an expert, and I can't predict what's going to happen in the near future or even in the long term. Well, I think in the long-term future, Iran is going to have to change because the people want change. And when I say the people want change, even those people who support the regime want change. Very few people are satisfied with the status quo. Unless you're someone who's in the Basij and are very happy with the situation and are getting your monthly check and that's what you want. I wouldn't say that the large majority of Iranians are satisfied with the status quo. Whether they're dissatisfied economically, which usually is the #1 issue for most people, and not just in Iran, everywhere in the world, or whether they're dissatisfied with social restrictions or political restrictions. It depends on who you ask and what someone's preferences or what someone's priorities are. But most people are dissatisfied, and with a very young population, this system, the way it exists today, and with the it's an old cliche now, but it's already become a cliche. But in the world of Facebook and the internet and communication with the outside world and communication even among people in the same country, it is going to be impossible for the Iranian regime to stay the same way that it is, unless we do something to prolong that life, unless we do something to continue to make it easy for the Iranian government to behave the way it does towards its own people. Right now we're on that path, but we're also in an election year in the United States, so I think there are very, very few options for President Obama when it comes to Iran. I think if he can avoid war between now and November, there probably won't ever be a war with Iran. And then hopefully, I think certainly the Iranian leadership recognizes this, people that I've spoken to, that a re-elected President Obama has a lot more latitude in terms of what he can do with Iran, which will only be good for civil society in Iran if there is some form of reduction in the hostility between the West and Iran, and more of an opening for Iran to be able to join what Hillary Clinton says, the family of nations. in a way that that enables for there to be trade, for their businesses to flourish in Iran, in order for a middle class to be able to have a voice. Because once you remove the excuse from the government that everything is related to national security, everything is about the regime being threatened, everything is about regime change. Once you remove that excuse, as happened during Khatami's time, when President Khatami was president for 8 years, Iran was not under threat. The only country that was sanctioning Iran was the United States, basically. I mean, there were some military sanctions by European countries, but not any kind of broad economic sanctions. And it was very difficult for even someone like Ayatollah Khamenei, who doesn't believe in liberalism or liberal democracy in any form, not even a liberal Islamic democracy. It's very difficult for him to deny the population some of the demands that they had at the time. And so Iran did have a much more open society at that time. It did have civil society. Yes, it's true, critics will say that under Khatami people got thrown in jail and that and so on and so forth. So it's true that it was never a perfect system. But it was very different, the atmosphere, than it is today. So my own hope is that we return to a situation where Iran cannot use that excuse of national security to suppress any civil movements, civil society, and Iran will progress. There's a tremendous amount of talent in Iran. There's a tremendous amount of intelligence in Iran. It could be a partner to a lot of nations, whether it's under an Islamic system or not. But we also have to recognize that there's a large group of people in Iran who will want to maintain the Islamic character of Iran. So it's always going to look a little different to us than a Western liberal democracy. In the same way that, if Rick Santorum becomes president, America's going to look a little different. We'll all be wearing crosses. I don't want to go too long because I know that it's mostly about questions and answers. So I'll take some questions now.
Thank you.
I don't know how you want to do it. Do you want to raise your hand and
just raise your hand
and just let me pick, or Dr. Hacker?
No, go ahead, please.
First one. There you go. Red T-shirt. If you stand up, I can hear you better.
All right. I took both the books and your speech just now and a couple of interviews I've seen on TV. I get the feeling that you really like President Khatami and his regime in a sense. And I was wondering if you have any major criticisms of that era. And I mean, the only thing I got from the book that I was able to infer was through a compliment to Ahmadinejad that he overtly defied the supreme leader on a couple instances, and in that Khatami failed by not having done so. But I was wondering if there's any other major criticism.
Well, you're absolutely right. I certainly don't deny that I'm a fan of Khatami, but there's also a family relationship, and I make that very clear in my books. I am a fan of his. I'm not a blind fan of his. I mean, when I see him and we talk, we definitely have disagreements. His defense of not standing up to the supreme leader when he could have, and this is a criticism that's been leveled at him inside Iran by many people who were disappointed in Khatami's presidency, or felt that he didn't go far enough, and felt that Iran didn't progress far enough. Yeah, sure, it was better, in the summer girls could, wear looser headscarves and there were less, airshot cars going around arresting women. But they're saying, well, that wasn't enough. No, we wanted this, we wanted that, we wanted that. His response to that is, we didn't know that we could challenge the supreme leader. Every time that we did, we thought that, it's not so much about worrying about their own lives, the people who were in the administration or being thrown in jail or being arrested. The sense was that, at any time the hardliners would crack down in a way, as they did on the students in 1999. And if they really challenged, if someone like Khatami, who did have a lot of popular support, really challenged the supreme leader, and say, for example, one day asked for his supporters to come out on the streets and have like 10 million people on the streets of Tehran, it could result in a bloodbath. And his view is that he wasn't willing to do that at the time. He wasn't willing to be responsible for other people being hurt. You can say that's a cowardly thing, but that's his view. I'm not sure, because I've never been in that position where I've had to worry about anybody else's life. or anybody else's future. And that's why I'm a journalist. It makes it easy. I don't have to worry about other people. But for people who are in power, I don't judge them necessarily for that. I judge them for when they don't, when they lie or when they don't act on their beliefs. And in his case, he was acting on his beliefs, and he said that many times. But he believed that the system had to be changed gradually and not overnight, that he couldn't challenge the system. And again, it goes back to something I said earlier, is that people inside Iran, whether they're in the opposition or whether they're just in the reformist camp, whether in the Green Movement or the people who want regime change, they all recognize that the regime does have support, does have people. And it's not just thugs. We hear of this idea, oh, the Basiji thugs are out, paid thugs. You give them an orange juice and they'll come out and beat anybody on the streets. That's part of what the Iranian diaspora says. Oh, these guys are, they just give them some orange juice and they come out. Now, I've seen them. They're not just there for the orange juice. They're there for the money in some cases, yes. They're there because of the privileges that they're given, yes. But they're also from very religious families who believe, their local mullah, that believe, and there's an ideology there that they believe in. And the people in Iran who are in the opposition recognize that. They recognize that these are the people who, they have to go up against. Some of them are thugs, yes, but some of them aren't. Some of them just really believe they're protecting their wives and their sisters, from this Western onslaught. And so it's a challenge to get those people to come over to your side. It's a challenge to get those people from the Green Movement. It was a big challenge to try to get, the South Tehranis to come and join the demonstrations. They weren't able to. By and large, they weren't able to. I'm not saying nobody from South Tehran demonstrated, but by and large, they were unable to get those people. So this is a challenge they face in the future. But I hope I answered the question in terms of Khatami. But yeah, I don't deny that, that I'm a fan of his, and I'm a fan of what Iran was trying to do then, or at least what his administration was trying to do. In that he failed, I think he would admit that as well. Next. Yes, sir.
Hi. I read The Ayatollah's Democracy, and I was wondering, besides talking to the high-powered elites, how do you do research for such a book? Who do you go out and talk to really gain a sense of, I suppose, the pulse of people in Iran from all, I guess, facets of society?
Yeah, well, everybody has friends, and friends have friends, and when you try to cross class barriers, and Iran is still a class society, so it's difficult to talk to people outside of your environment, let's say. But again, through the friends that you have, and through if you want to talk to someone who's a chauffeur, it's not that hard to find someone who can get you to talk to a chauffeur. If you want to talk to the local greengrocer, if you shop at his store 4 or 5 times, he'll feel more comfortable in talking to you. And one of the reasons I spent 9 months in Iran this last time was so I could have that comfort level and really get further into society than I have in my previous trips, which were always the longest trip was 6 weeks. So I felt with 6 weeks I could get in, a little bit. But when you're living there and people know you have an address and the intelligence ministry knows you have an address, it's a different thing than when you're there temporarily. But yeah, so you make an effort. As a journalist, you make an effort to talk to as many different people as possible. If you're talking about a political situation, opposition and the government, if you're talking about social issues, or you're talking about the people of the country, traveling around, truck drivers, hitching rides even, which I've done in Iran. Things like that. And then you try to talk to their families, a cop, the local beat cop. You see them 3 or 4 times, usually they'll open up to you after 3 or 4 times, especially if you don't appear to be too threatening, which is why the beard helps. Yes.
How many times did you get frustrated in your experience?
In my experience in
Iran.
Living there?
Living there, talking to the people, and observing.
How many times? Countless. I can't tell you how many times. Probably 20 times a day. Multiply that by 9 months, or however time. Yeah, absolutely. Iran's a very frustrating place to live, or to work.
In your experience, and what gave you the ultimate pleasure at the end?
Food. I don't know. I guess the food. Yeah, the fruit. I still miss the fruit. I've only been back a couple of months. I can't believe I can't get a persimmon here, or at least a good Persian persimmon. What gives you the ultimate pleasure, I mean, that goes back to a very personal thing, just feeling, I feel very American, but I also feel connected to the, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but connected to that soil. Maybe it's because I was born there, maybe that dust and that, you know, the air had something to do with it, the altitude, 5,000 feet. There's something about it, and there's something about the music, the poetry, the people, the language, even when they frustrate you terribly and you say, I hate Iran and I hate Iranians, and I'm guilty of this myself. I hate all Iranians. I'm a self-loathing Iranian, which happened at least once a day. I can assure you that there's still, at the end of the day, apart from the meal that I'm looking forward to, or the afternoon pomegranate juice from the local stand, there's also just the fact that it is, with all its warts and all, it is still part of who I am. And yeah, I mean, I think we all need a certain amount of self-loathing. Even as an American, I have self-loathing. When I look at the Republican debates, I hate myself. I hate being an American then. So, you know, that's a form of self-criticism, I think. But yeah, Iran is very frustrating, particularly for us, for people who have lived abroad and have a certain expectation of what life is. It's very difficult. I mean, in last year, for example, and continuing into this year, the government's decided that they're going to slow down the internet for some reason, for a lot of reasons. And I just imagine every morning when I wake up, I imagine the guy, there's like this big dial, like in the movie Brazil. And he's, you know, depending on whether his wife was nice to him that morning or whether the, you know, the sour cherry jam was off that day, he's going to go, fuck you all, and excuse my language, and I'm turning it way down and nobody gets the internet. And then like his kids call him up on his cell phone and everybody has a cell phone. Dad, I can't go. Oh, okay, I'll put it up a little bit. And that drives you absolutely bananas. I mean, you wake up in the morning, you can't go on a website, you can't, but everybody has a VPN, so people know how to get around those limitations. But the speed of the internet, when you're so used to it, that just makes you want to say, you know, what's wrong with you people? You feel also beyond just your own personal frustration, you feel like this is blocking the progress of a country that is so talented. So a country that's 17 million Facebook users, in a country where Facebook is banned. In fact, Facebook, if you're on Facebook, technically you're committing a crime and could be thrown in jail. That doesn't stop Ali Larijani's website from having its own Facebook page, which is, the contradictions just blow your mind every day. So, you know, the first time I realized they had a Facebook page is because the Speaker of Parliament, his family is a very powerful family. They have a website called Khabar Online, News Online. It's a conservative website, very anti-Ahmadinejad. The day I arrived in Tehran in March last year, they found out, I don't know how, probably through the intelligence ministry that I was there, had my cell phone number. Mr. Majd, want to invite you to do an interview. You can't say no to the Larijani. So I said, fine. I go there, and then 2 days later, I get a Facebook notification that, you know, Khabar Online has posted your picture on Facebook. It's like, wait a second. I thought Facebook was illegal. But so frustrations like that, the contradictions that you face every day, but I don't think it's unique to Iran, by the way. I think a lot of the countries in the Middle East have those contradictions, and we all laugh about them. The Iranians who live there on a daily basis laugh about them every day. It's just the, you know, the contradictions of life in Iran. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Saeed. If I'm right, you were the President Ahmadinejad's translator at the United Nations. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if the speech was given to you the night before.
Oh, not the night before, no. Do
you have any stories?
Yeah. I'll tell you how it came about, because for people who don't know, I did talk about it in my first book. President Khatami came to the U.S. in 2006, and he asked me if I would be his sort of like advisor, unpaid advisor. And he was traveling around the country, and it had to be unpaid. Traveling, he was coming as a private citizen, not as a president anymore. He had already been out of office. And I said, of course. Being a family member, and his people in his administration were friends of mine and who were traveling with him, Sadegh Harazi, his brother, his chief of staff. So I said, sure, be happy to. So we traveled around. The first stop was in Chicago. He had a conference, Islamic conference, and he was going to give a speech. And, you know, 3 hours before his speech, they realized they didn't have an interpreter. I would have thought they would have thought about this in Iran, but they'd sent me the speech, and I fixed it, because I can't really read Farsi, so they sent me a really bad translation. I fixed the English. And they said, well, who's gonna do the translation? And we said, well, we don't have anybody. Well, Human, you do it. It's like, what do you mean I do it? I'm not an interpreter. I can't do that. Well, you don't, but you've got the speech in front of you. You can just read it and you'll hear what he's saying. You'll be sitting right next to him. So, I said, fine, I'll do this one time. So I did it, and then everybody said, oh, that was great, it was fantastic. So then I did it for the rest of his trip, the universities we visited and places like that. And then the Ahmadinejad people, he had been in office a year, I think they'd seen some of this because it had been shown on television in Iran, and said, we want him to do our translation. So I called, they called me and said, would you do it? And I said, yeah, under one condition, that I can write about it, and there's nothing is off the record. You know, if I meet with him, if I meet with any of his aides, and all that. I said, yeah, sure, no problem. So then I called my editor at the New York Observer and said, you know, should we do a story on this? And they said, yes, it became a cover story the first time I did it. So in 2007 and 2008, they asked me again, and I said, yeah, sure, because it's an opportunity to be able to write about it. So that's how it came about. But in terms of what, with President Khatami, he would write his speeches way in advance. They'd go through them, you'd sit down and talk about it. You know, he and I would talk about what it says, and I'd say, is this really what you want to say, and things like that. With Ahmadinejad, he wouldn't even let his closest aide see what he was writing until like an hour before.
He does his own.
Oh yes, he does his own speeches. Unfortunately, he does. Yes, and he doesn't listen, which is to anybody else's opinion. So, including his closest aides. And my understanding was the times that I was involved with them was that, which was through the UN mission in Iran, mostly, but through the foreign ministry in Tehran, is that he writes most of it on the plane coming here, and then kind of like fixes it up, and it's not really ready till the last moment, and then he decides to, you know, this big bombshell, like 9/11 was a big conspiracy. But he doesn't have it vetted by the supreme leader, which is something that with Khatami, out of courtesy, would be at least shown to, you know, this is what we're representing Iran, this is what we're going to say. But Ahmadinejad, no, he doesn't care what anybody thinks. Yes?
Do you think the West is exaggerating the nuclear threat that Iran presents? And if not, what do you think a more productive approach to sanctions would be?
Or if so, you know.
I'm sure.
Okay. Okay. Either way, yes. Of course, it's exaggerating the nuclear threat. Of course, it is. I don't think it's any. It can't be a question in anybody's mind that the threat. First of all, because Iran doesn't have a bomb. It's not anywhere near having a bomb, according to everybody, including people who are, you know, most opposed to an Iranian nuclear program. I mean, Americans who are. So therefore, it's exaggerated by definition. This idea that, you know, we're going to go to war today because we have to stop them from having a bomb. Well, certainly we don't have to go to war, and the threat is exaggerated. The other thing is that Iranians don't view Iran as a threat, even if it did have a nuclear bomb. What actually surprises me in conversations with people inside Iran is when you do ask them about the nuclear issue, how many people who are actually opposed to the regime will say, oh, why shouldn't we have a bomb? Israel has a bomb, Pakistan has a bomb. It's actually a little bit more of a nationalistic issue, and people don't really view inside Iran. I've come across very few people who view inside Iran, it's different outside Iran, but inside Iran view the potential for Iran to have nuclear weapons or to have a nuclear energy program as something that is the Ayatollah's program or a mullah's program or an Islamic bomb. They really view it much more in terms of the nation having the progress, having made the progress to where it's a part of the nuclear club. So yes, I do believe that it's a nuclear weapon, or if they did have a nuclear program. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me because first of all, I don't think you can stop Iran from developing a bomb if they want to, if they really want to. It's impossible to bomb the knowledge out of them at this point. Even if you kill more scientists in Iran, you're still not going to bomb the knowledge. There's certain knowledge that they already have. So if they want to develop a nuclear weapon, I think they can and they will. If you bomb them, they certainly will go and develop a nuclear weapon. The more you threaten Iran, I think the more likely it is they'll be incentivized to have a nuclear weapon before the bombs actually start dropping. I think, you know, it might be easy to say, but I think the only way to deal with the Iranian nuclear issue is a practical form of dialogue. The Iranians don't, I mean, you got to separate, I think people on the left, like myself, we have to separate the issue of the nuclear issue from Iran's human rights issue, or whether we like the Iranian regime or not. They really are two separate issues. Whether Iran has certain rights as a nation, whether its sovereignty means something, And then there's a separate issue of its internal political dynamic, which I don't think should be confused, in my opinion. I think we can be critical of the Iranian regime for many things, but it's unfair to be critical of them over the nuclear issue, I think. I don't think you can put the two together or say, oh, because they're willing to beat up people on the streets or throw them in jail for their political opinion, then they shouldn't have a bomb. One thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. And by the way, if they had a bomb, they're not going to use it on their own people, because that means they would be committing suicide themselves. So no country has ever used nuclear weapons on itself. So that's not a threat. It's not a threat to regime. And in fact, the regime knows that having a nuclear weapon does not immunize you from regime change from within. It might immunize you from regime change from without, but as far as I can tell, the Iranian people don't really want there to be regime change from without. They don't want it imposed from outside. We don't want Ahmad Chalabi types coming, galloping into Tehran. So our Iranians don't. At least the Iranians in Iran don't. So what can be done, I think, is some practical things that are impossible in an election year. I mean, American politics doesn't allow for President Obama to do what he needs to do, which is to come out and recognize certain rights that Iran has and come out and give certain security guarantees to Iran so that it doesn't build them on. De-incentivize them is what I say. And security guarantees means like, we will abide by the Algiers Accord. We won't interfere in your internal domestic politics. We won't have the CIA put $400 million to initiate regime change or destabilize the regime. We won't talk to the MEK. We won't talk to Jundullah. We won't do those things, and this is our guarantee. So now we want you to guarantee us that this, and this will happen. You'll sign the additional protocol. You'll do this. You'll do that. And I think they would find even this regime, as hateful as it might be, would probably want to come to terms with that, because it would mean probably, in their own minds at least, their own survival for a while. And then the added benefit would be that the middle class can survive as well. Yes?
You said that you're a fan of what happened during the reform. I actually lived my life and went to school under the 8 years of President Khatami. My question is, how come if that was what was really working, were people a little bit more comfortable with, the outside world was a little bit more comfortable with, why didn't it continue? I mean, what happened that we have this administration that is basically a problem on the hands of the world? We know that the ideology of the Islamic Republic is to a great extent based on enemy. This enemy can be a real enemy or it can be an imagined enemy. So I'm trying to figure out what happened that the reform did not continue, did not last.
That's a very good question. You probably know more than I do about that. You can probably answer the question better than I do. I think it's speculation, whatever the answer is. I think that I think there was a certain amount of disappointment, and I sense from even yourself in the reform movement at the end of Khatami's term. There was certainly a lot of people. I would get into taxis and people, obviously not knowing that I'm related to Khatami, would swear at him. So I mean, sophisticated people who didn't like him for some of the reasons that we've talked about. The fact that there wasn't enough reform, there wasn't enough movement, there wasn't any opening with America that a lot of people were hoping for, and that he was hoping for too, obviously, as we know. I don't know what the answer is. I think part of the problem is in the system, the political system in Iran, which isn't about political parties, it's about personalities. I mean, I would bet anybody on the streets of Tehran, sophisticated people, and certainly people in here, to name me the main political parties in Iran. I bet you they couldn't. I mean, you can, I'm sure, and I'm sure there's some students here who can. I can't, but I've already said I'm not an academic, so I'm excused. But most people don't know about political parties. That this idea, oh, this is reformist and this is conservative, and that's it. There isn't this idea of a political party being able to come together and come up with a candidate, for example, to replace Khatami, to be the next president, to be someone to continue what Khatami has done. So we don't have that in Iran. We haven't had it. We've had personality. So you had this personality, Ahmadinejad, in 2005, who was much more appealing as a personality than Hashemi Rafsanjani, who were like, even the reformists didn't like him. Even though he was obviously a more pragmatic person and more in line with what the reformists would have wanted to continue. But you had this very kind of like, at that time anyway, this is pre-Holocaust denial, pre-wiping Jews off the map or Israel off the map, all the other things he's done. At that time, he was kind of charming and he was Mustazafin. He was like, from the people, he was a man of the people. He was the guy who rode garbage trucks when he was the mayor of Tehran. There was a certain appeal. I knew upper middle class Iranians, wealthy upper middle class Iranians, who serve liquor in their homes and have parties, who voted for him. It was like, you know, because he was a nationalist, he was going to bring about change. Ahmadinejad was going to bring about change for Iran. They say now that they regret doing that in 2005, but they did. I think it's because it was about personality, and Iranian politics today continues to be about personality. And it's been that way since forever. In Mossadegh's time, it was personality. Him, the Shah, weak personality, Mossadegh, strong personality, roles are reversed. I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but certainly we all, to this day, we have people think, oh, you know, the Shah, Khadabiyan was the man, not the institution, but the man. Oh, he was great. Khatami was great. Khomeini was great for some people. For some people, Khomeini was awful. You know, again, the personality. And now we're talking about personalities again. We're talking about Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, these two personalities. In a year's time, we're going to be talking about whoever the personality is. Is it Larijani? We're not going to be talking about what his party represents, what he represents. It's about him. It's going to be about Ghalibaf, the mayor of Tehran. Everybody loves him. Not everybody. A lot of people love Ghalibaf. I think that's a fundamental problem with our political system in Iran. And, you know, in Khatami's case, a certain weakness on his part in not developing a party, his party, not developing that party so that people understood that there was a party they could join, a party that they could believe in, and a platform that could exist for this party. So, you know, if you had a good personality as the candidate for that party, it stood a better chance. I mean, why didn't everybody who voted, 70%, why didn't those people who voted for Khatami vote for Moin in the first, you know, why not? You could say he was a weak candidate, and he was a weak candidate, but people didn't even know who he was or what the party was, what the platform was. So that's my educated guess.